let's shift from talking about central banks to the Australian Central Bank, which Dr. Rod, you mentioned before, which was the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia. They have just done an overhaul of their board. Now, that seems like something, I don't know, kind of when you first hear it, it's like, oh, are they in danger? Is that scary? The Reserve Bank is meant to be this stable thing, and there's an uphaul with their whole board and everything like that. But it's a good thing. Is that right? Like what's happening with the RBA in Australia, Dr. Rod?
Well, a lot of things could happen. The report, which has only just been released, it was delivered to the government on the 31st of March, which was just inside their deadline. They were supposed to report by the end of March. So the report's dated the 31st of March. And it's made 51 recommendations, some of which may well affect what's happening at the level of interest rates generally throughout the economy. Many of the other recommendations really refer to more internal stuff, like there's a lot of recommendations in there concerning their own staff and all kinds of things. I suppose probably the two most important recommendations, and the government has said that they will accept all 51, at least in principle. There might be a few little changes as we go, but they've said that in principle, they support all 51 recommendations. The major ones that are likely to affect Australians generally will be a move to create two boards. Currently, the Reserve Bank of Australia, like most companies, has a board. Now, that board has responsibilities in terms of the governance function that any board would have, but they also have responsibility for establishing what we call in Australia the target cash rate, which is essentially the rate of interest on funds that are borrowed overnight by banks when they borrow from one another. Now, one of the major recommendations is that we establish one board to provide the governance function, which would be like the board of any public company, for example, and then another board of expert advisors who will make the running on setting that cash interest rate target. Now, that other board will be populated primarily, as I understand it, by experts in economics. That bothers me a little bit, as someone who knows a bit about economics and economists, because they don't always get it right. And sometimes, they sort of grab onto a theory which doesn't turn out to be too good in practice. And we've had fairly recent experience of that with what they call modern monetary theory, which essentially says the government can spend money and we can print money, and that will increase production, so you don't have to worry too much about inflation. I'm oversimplifying it, but that turned out to be a bad theory. And it's not getting much of a run these days. But look, in principle, I don't think that can do us any great harm in separating the functions. So you've got, broadly speaking, a normal governance board and then this specialist board, which will make the calls on interest rates. They're proposing to reduce the number of meetings from 11 per year to 8. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, particularly if they're very fast-moving events. That it may be advisable to be meeting more frequently than that. And I'm not really sure if there's a good reason for reducing those meetings. It might reduce some costs, but I don't know whether that will necessarily ultimately prove to be a good thing for Australia.
Is the idea of that then there's going to be less potential, fewer potential times that the interest rate is then going to change?
Yeah, but look, I think maybe I'm a little bit out of step with a lot of others, but I feel that throughout its history, and I've been sort of hanging around this idea now for about 40 years. I'm not a spring chicken. My observation is that the Reserve Bank has generally been quite conservative with interest rates. In other words, I think there's a kind of corporate desire to keep interest rates as low as they can and as stable as they can.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that, generally speaking, they've wrecked our economy. I think, generally speaking, they've done a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm.
Now, certainly, one of the issues that came up was that the governor of the Reserve Bank, that is the boss and the chair of the board, he made a statement a couple of years ago now that there wouldn't be interest rate increases until 2024. Yep. Now, as it turned out, that was wrong. Now, I think the reason why he had the confidence to make that statement was that he, the board in general, the people in the bank who are providing advice and so on, had really got onto this modern monetary theory bandwagon, and they weren't expecting inflation to turn out the way it did. But of course, we got inflation. All those countries that spent billions and billions and billions of dollars during COVID, which was financed effectively by printing money, they've now all got relatively high rates of inflation. And so central banks all over the world are responding with fairly rapid increases in interest rates. But look, even in Australia, it's nothing like it is in many, many other countries. So I will still argue that the Reserve Bank has tended to be quite conservative. So I don't think reducing the number of meetings each year is going to make that much difference, frankly.
But tell me, how does this change of creating a second board and all that sort of stuff, how does it, because obviously that's the story that you just shared of the who was he? He was the governor. He said that they'd stay, the rates wouldn't change until 2024, and then we just went through a couple of rate rises.
Oh yeah, we've had 10 rate rises consecutively, except last month rates were stable, and some of the market economists are predicting that they won't make any changes at their next meeting either. So people get a bit of a breather, I suppose you could say.
How does this board change stop that issue? Because obviously the news are jumping on.
Experts. The answer is always experts. You put experts on this board, so they're going to have better performance. I mean, I don't agree with that because I know what experts are like. And look, the major cause of inflation is government spending. Anybody who's done first-year economics in university or even high school economics, it's as plain as the nose on my face, which is a relatively big nose, all right? It's government spending. Inflation has not been the fault of the central banks. Now, you might argue that in the case of Australia, we didn't increase interest rates soon enough. Well, that you could level that argument at central banks around the world because they'd been lulled into a false sense of security. They were all surprised by how rapidly inflation took off. There's a few like me who weren't because we never bought into modern monetary theory in the first place. But on the whole, you know, the economics profession was kind of swept with this new approach to understanding economics and economic policy. It just turned out to be wrong. Well, that wouldn't be the first time. So just having experts doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better outcomes, in my opinion. And it's just that. It's just an opinion. But look, I have had a look through the report. I can't claim that I've read it word for word, but I have looked through the report. It's a pretty good report. It's pretty thorough. They've certainly, the three people who are on the panel, who are experts themselves, by the way, they've done quite a lot of research, or they probably didn't do it themselves. They had it done, but I had a look at all the references in the back of the report, pretty comprehensive. But look, I think what was lacking really was deep analysis about how effective the Reserve Bank Australia has been, say, over the last 50 years as compared to other central banks. Look, from what I've seen, it's no worse, really no better than others. Look, the other major change that we need, I think, to touch on, Craig, is that the Reserve Bank will shift its emphasis from a very strong focus on keeping inflation within 2 to 3% per annum to also being concerned directly about full employment, however you measure that. And we can have long debates about how to measure full employment.
Really?
Now, look, it was in the original Reserve Bank Act, the Reserve Bank Act 1959 listed full employment as one of the objectives of the central bank anyway. One of the problems is, and again, look, if you studied a little bit of economics, you would know this, it's pretty difficult to hit two targets using the same policy lever.
Mm-hmm.
And look, you can prove that with nice, elegant mathematical models. And everybody who studied economics in university in the 1970s went through the mathematics to prove it. I don't know that it's being taught in many universities. Look, frankly, economics isn't being taught in a lot of universities these days. So I think probably economic literacy is a lot less than it used to be overall. And a lot of people who might be regarded as experts don't know enough economics to be experts in economics, quite frankly. But I think this is a recipe for making the Reserve Bank less effective, because their main instrument or their main policy lever is interest rates.
Yeah.
And at certain times, there's clearly a trade-off between keeping inflation low and having full employment.
Yeah.
And so goodness only knows how the board of experts are going to sort that one out. And there was a lot of research and a long debate in the late 1970s and early 1980s about this. And the broad conclusion was that your central bank, using the monetary lever, should focus on keeping inflation low. I think it's unwise to move to those dual goalposts, because while they do need to take into account how interest rates might affect employment, because that's real people we're dealing with, the outcomes of their decisions, both on interest rates. It's real people who gain or lose, and quite frankly, there are gainers and losers every time interest rates are changed in either direction. So that's the other big shift, and I don't have a good feeling about that. I don't know that that's going to do us a positive favour in the long run. But those are the two main changes: having a separate board of experts doing the interest rate thing, and then broadening the objectives to focus, well, really to take it back to the original Reserve Bank Act. That's, as far as I can see, that's what they're doing. I don't think it augurs well. Look, unless you've got a central bank that's dealing with inflation and a government that's reining in its expenditure, and you only want a deficit when the economy is going into recession. But we're running deficits basically all the time. We'll run decades of deficits. And
so when you say that, does the RBA or a central bank, do they have any influence over the government and their spending? Because isn't it, if the government says print money, it's that central bank that prints the money? Is that correct?
Well, it doesn't work quite like that. But one way of funding government deficits is they essentially borrow money from the central bank. Because remember, the central bank is banker to the government.
Yes.
But unlike you and me, you and I have to go to the bank cap in hand and ask them for money, right?
Mm-hmm.
The federal government really doesn't have to ask; they just take it. So
just do a withdrawal.
When they bring up account balance, like that.
It's unlimited, is it?
I mean, effectively, the government the government has an unlimited overdraft through its own central bank. That's what it amounts to.
That'd be nice.
Look, if we want long-term, consistent, low inflation, high employment, and reasonable rates of growth, governments have to get out of the habit of overspending.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So this shift, good thing, bad thing, indifferent?
Look, I don't have confidence that a board of experts is necessarily going to do it better than we already have. But I don't think that will do us any harm. I am more concerned about how on earth we hit two targets using the same instrument.
Yeah,
It's like aiming an arrow at two targets.
Well,
you can hit one or the other, but you're not going to get them both.
As Confucius says, he who chases two rabbits catches none. Right? Yeah. Like it's almost like that. I like that.
Yeah. So look, just if I can say, overall, it's a pretty good review. And I know some commentators, especially on the conservative side, have been very critical of it. There have been comments made, for example, they haven't done any research, et cetera. But I would say they've actually done quite a lot of research. They've taken input from a lot of experts, many of whom have long experience in these matters. So I would say it's a pretty well-researched document. Mm-hmm. Most of the recommendations are quite sensible, and they will improve the overall governance of our central bank. Those two main ones, though, the first probably won't make a big difference. The second, I think, is going to lead to problems in the future.
From a governance point of view, you mentioned governance, and I know your specialty areas is governance. This whole two-board idea, is that a normal, not normal, but has that been done? Is that done anywhere else?
Yes, it's not all that rare. It does happen elsewhere. And look, it may be that we really shouldn't call it a board. So you just say you've got a governance board and then you've got this other body.
Yeah.
Because it's not a board in the normal sense of.
So it's almost just a committee.
Board. You could call it something like the Committee on Interest Rates if you wanted to, or the Committee on Monetary Policy or something like that. So having the two boards itself isn't going to create any. There won't be any problems that arise from the two boards per se. Put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's bring it back to us as leaders. That's really good information for us to know. Be aware as leaders. Be aware that these changes are happening. How can it affect us? Probably not just being aware of how it affects the monetary interest rate. What can we learn as leaders? There was a couple of key things that you mentioned in there. Obviously, he who chases two rabbits catches none. So make sure that we know what our goal is, what our one goal is. Now, yes, in business, there's a whole bunch of things we have to do. We have to juggle a whole bunch of balls and spin a lot of plates while we're trying to ride a unicycle. Like, yes, there's all these things we have to do as leaders, but we need to know what our ultimate one goal, our one outcome, or ultimately our purpose. I think I would put it down to. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing that you did mention, you repeated it a lot. Emphasized it a lot. Is I don't really trust experts, or what are experts? My dad used to say an expert is just a former drip under pressure, right? So probably some older generation will get that. That might go straight over the head of others. But rewind this back and listen to it again and see if you get it. But obviously, we need experts. Obviously, I mean, I'm a business coach. I advise people on running their businesses and things like that. So I would consider myself an expert. I would consider you an expert. I wouldn't discredit experts straight away, but I kind of agree with what you're saying, and let me try to maybe put my words to what you're saying. Is what I think you're saying is experts, we need to take on their advice, but we can't blindly take on their advice. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is like experts, yes, we have to take their information, like you're saying, this report, it's been put together by experts, it's good information, but then we need to interpret and apply that with wisdom ourselves.
Well, just don't treat experts like you treat God. That's all I would say. Experts are fallible.
Yes.
and you see, the thing is, experts are usually operating on the basis of an underlying theory. And that theory may or may not turn out to be a good theory for the particular circumstances that the economy finds itself in at any particular time. And economists have learned a lot over the last 200 years. And I think on the whole, policy has been better for it. But economics, like every other academic discipline, is actually subject to fads.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a little bit skeptical of experts. Look, I'm the best expert, right?
Yes.
And that's how we all think.
I agree.
That's how we all think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we do need a healthy dose of skepticism. And you know, I always like to know, well, what theoretical perspective or even worldview is the expert coming from? Because it does make a difference.
Yeah. I really like that perspective of like, every expert is basing their expertise on a particular theory and a particular outcome. So or on a particular principle, we need to make sure we know what that principle is that they're basing that on to know that we agree with it or not. And if it's, like you mentioned, worldview, is it in line with my worldview? Is there something I can learn from it, or is it something that I won't take from it? Because there are a lot of experts out there and all these gurus talking about, running a business and bettering your life and managing your money and investing and all that. There's a lot of gurus out there, but I think that's a really good point. Is like, what is their foundational principles? What are they basing their expertise on, or their opinion? What's their underlying theory? I think that's actually really good advice, Dr. Rod. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's actually, I'll finish this off with a little quote that there was an expert. Now, I found a link to say that an expert says, but I kept following the links of the references and no one actually said who that expert was. But I'm going to say this about the RBA. An expert says Australians should not be under any illusions that changes will result in lower interest rates. Because there is a lot of stuff talking about that with the board. Oh, now they're going to manage interest rates better. They're going to stay low and everything like that. Don't be under any illusion that that's going to be the case. They may come in, as Dr. Rod said, they're experts. They may just come in, and they're economists, which have a different theory. They may run it up. Who knows? Maybe they may fall in love with the days when interest rates were 18%. But let's hope not. Let's pray. And at the end of the day, like Dr. Rod said about experts, they're not God. There is only one. And he is in control. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership Podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it challenged your leadership or inspired you in some way, put a comment below. And if you want to watch the full episode or more content like this, check out our channel. And hey, consider subscribing while you're there.